let's talk about Tesla and maybe give some context from my experience of reading him. And I've read a lot of Tesla and a lot of his context to give some sense of kind of where he was coming from and what the concerns were around him. He was like the guy dealing with matters called electricity, and back then in the early 1900s, late 1800s, electricity was a relatively kind of new kind of scientific focus and phenomenon.
Like voodoo, right? Like people weren't flying yet. There were no planes yet.
Yeah, and energy was this. Electricity was this thing that carried all this potential. You know, when they started realizing the potential for, let's say, the ability of this new form of energy to do work, which was very, very strong. And so the rush became, okay, how are we going to actually get this form of energy to people for to tap this ability of this energy to do work? And Tesla played a major role in those kind of early investigations and commercial struggles to define what is going to be the means of getting electricity to people. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So he dove in from a kind of an engineer's angle of kind of looking at this phenomenon and asking himself, it's a relatively new phenomenon. You know, it had been only defined, not so many years previous by James Clerk Maxwell and people associated with him in a new set of equations that defined the entire field as this unified electromagnetic field. And there Tesla is trying to find a way to kind of figure this stuff out for himself so that he can find what he considered the appropriate means to distribute it.
Right.
Right. So he was, as a researcher and investigator and an inventor, he was not a theoretical scientist. He was a scientist who was interested in experiment and in very practical, pragmatic manifestation of anything he experimented with. And so as an experimenter, he was kind of in the top rank of people who experiment. The important thing experimenting is that you actually pay attention to what is happening before you. And Tesla had an incredibly acute sense of kind of looking at his own experience, which is what he's doing. He's only always ever looking at his own experience of what he's doing, and looking within that experience to see, okay, what is happening in my experience in this kind of context. And there came a time when he was playing around with some very high voltage circuits, some DC circuits, which, for the audience means direct current, which means it just goes one way and doesn't stop and come the other way. It just continues to go one way and at a fairly constant voltage. Mm-hmm. He had a high voltage DC circuit, and when he turned that circuit on, what he noticed was that there was this like spiky energy that radiated out just for a flash of a second around the main conductor carrying this high voltage to his circuitry. And his circuitry was very large, so it's like the entire room or the entirety of a big building or whatever else. And so he looked at this purplish spiky energy and he asked himself, what is that? And kind of interestingly, that became the doorway to him kind of stepping into what effectively is a new dimension in terms of his own conceptual understanding about what this stuff called electricity is. His kind of counterparts in the industry never got to that level of kind of looking at the phenomena they were looking at to kind of step outside the little box of their own Newtonian understanding of what this could mean, which was, some ridiculous set of notions about particles bouncing around in empty space, and God knows how they get waves involved with all of that. Very confused. Mm-hmm. Tesla used that as a means it became a means of him stepping into like a new understanding of what electricity is about. And if you look at the implications of that step that he made, what becomes apparent and what became apparent to me is that this thing called electricity relates to the fundamental fabric of everything that can be called energy, which is everything we experience. That's a big step for him to have kind of vaunted himself into that kind of enormous context through this one tiny little observation, which he kept to. Let's go back to that observation. He closes the circuit, i.e. he makes it function. The spiky feeling appears, or the spikiness appears, and he also feels it. So he feels it in his chest. So he thinks, well, it looks like it's more than just around the conductor, because I'm feeling it too. So he then hides behind a series of what he attempted to construct as shields to shield this effect, and what he found is he couldn't shield it. So this is an effect that is somehow going through, various forms of matter. He had wood, and he had different types of metal, and he used glass, which is a crystal, and etc., to try to shield this, and he couldn't shield it. So here he's into a reality that is mysterious and unshieldable. So what he effectively discovered was that this thing we call electricity is tied into this reality which we inevitably call matter. And that matter and electricity, or matter and energy, are really fundamentally one thing. Mm-hmm. And that through the use of techniques employed electromagnetically, you can go into the actual root source of matter itself and affect material expression. That's enormous. And the clear implication, and you can draw this from Tesla's writings also, where he talks about his death ray and, the destructive potential of the kinds of energies the kinds of configurations of energy that he was toying with, very few of which people are actually given knowledge of. But he was such an investigator, I have zero question that he actually investigated the entire range of what is available to an investigator with the kinds of tools that he had and the kinds of, let's say, electronic circuitries he could build. Mm-hmm. And that range would include, anything you can kind of conceive of as a so-called property of matter. So he's levitating, he's disappearing matter, he's causing matter to appear, that kind of stuff.
Not good for business. Business as we know it.
Right, and so let's say you start, gaining some perspective why someone as powerful as J.P. Morgan, and just to assume, I think it's fair to assume that J.P. Morgan was essentially the American representative of the Rothschild financial empire, which, I think it's also fair to assume that it's the big control center for finance in the world. So you've got your number one guy in America checking this guy out. If you ask, okay, why do you got your number one guy in America checking this guy out? Well, you want to control it. You don't want somebody else going in there funding him and having to, then deal with whatever implications arise from him succeeding with this other funding source. Mm-hmm. You become the funding source in order to be the decision maker, mm-hmm. which you become when you are able to fund, which is why Rothschild is so powerful. You can't do anything without money. So anyway, so let's ask from that vantage point, and just assuming that what I've told you is, just assume that it's true for the moment. It's not within common experience to be able to test what I have said, except to say that you can go back to the record and see that everything I'm saying is consistent. I'm not misrepresenting what Tesla has himself talked about. And when I say that Tesla dealt with the range of things that can be considered material expression, I put that on the basis of an assumption. And I'm clear that I'm merely assuming that. Mm-hmm. But the people listening to this can go back to the record and see, for, let's say, Tesla closing that DC circuit, did he? And did he then feel it in his chest? And did he try to shield it, etc.? They can go to the record. It's all in the record. Assuming everything I've said is kind of ballpark true, what can we say about, how can we answer the question which so naturally arises, why Tesla was suppressed? Why was he called a nut bar? Why was his technology and his electromagnetic technique expunged from the record? It could be that it just doesn't exist, right? That's what is hoped to be believed by anything that is desired to be suppressed. So if you want to suppress something, you want to make people believe it doesn't exist, right? So yeah, okay, so it doesn't exist. That's one answer.
Area 51.
Sure, it doesn't exist.
Doesn't exist.
Right, doesn't exist. And so that's the main means of suppression. And if there's going to be suppression, it's going to be that. So that's one answer. Another answer is that because the electromagnetic technique that he was experimenting with could destructively affect material expression, to put it technically, then what you have is an ability through electromagnetics to destroy and disappear matter. And if that technique is easily learned, then you got a big problem on your hands. Mm-hmm. Because every garage tinker worth their salt, if they just kind of click into the right idea, you know, it's like sometimes you're looking at something, you can't see the pattern, and then boom, you see the pattern. And after that moment in time, you cannot not see that pattern. With kind of Tesla technique with electromagnetics, boom, as soon as you see it, oh, right, I see the pattern, right? And any Joe worth his salt is going to be able to come up to that reality, whether in their own kind of development of their thinking process, or as, and this might even be scarier, but who knows, or as a kind of like arbitrary result. They just happen to kind of do this over here, and oh, hey, it worked. And they recorded how they got there, and they don't know what it means.
But they know how they did it.
But they know how they did it.
Right.
But they don't know what they did actually, and they don't know other effects elsewhere, blah, blah, blah. So if you have an ability to create destruction at kind of like the root source of matter itself, which, you know, for, let's say, the listeners, they can just read Judy Wood about World Trade Center to see that that's a reality. If there is that ability, and if it's relatively easy to kind of, with some dedication, you know, Tesla just stumbled into it himself, right? To get to that place where you can create technique that can create that kind of destruction, then you have to suppress it. Okay, so this is a little rotary transformer, and we can call it a device to experiment in the Tesla field. And essentially what it's doing, it's creating a very high voltage inside there, and that voltage is radiating as, in the typical conceptuality, a static field. And so we are in a static field. But this field has some very special qualities about it, and we'll just turn the light off here and I'll show you. So this is a strip of LED lights. It's a replacement for a fluorescent bulb. And if you put this strip, which typically requires a circuit with so-called electrons flowing through it to make the LEDs light up inside. But if you put this LED strip close to this field, and I'm assuming here that the field gets stronger the closer you are to this device, the LEDs light up. So here we go. You can see the LEDs are lighting up here. They're also lighting up where my hand happens to be, which is a subtlety we can get into later. But if you notice how they are lighting up here, if I remove at some distance this strip from the field, the light dims. And at some point it goes out because it...
Still lit down there on your hand.
Sure. And so you can see the field strength is growing. And now watch what happened when I put my finger close, it's dimming. So my hand is absorbing this field preferentially to the LEDs inside this strip. Let's kind of segue back into talking about what Tesla was doing with that question of coherence in mind. That let's put it this way, first of all, that any powerful science, the most powerful science is a science of coherence. That is, it's a coherent science. It's a science whose conceptuality, how it conceives of the world, is itself coherent. And so, for instance, for quantum physics, which is a coherence science, quantum physics talks about things like non-locality and gives access to, let's say, a kind of, let's call it destructive power, where if you, in using the physics of quantum physics, combine matter and antimatter, which you've created using that physics, if you combine those two, you get 100% energy release from the nuclear foundation of those two bits of matter. And you can, let's say, create that into a beam. Let's call it a coherent laser matter-antimatter reaction in, let's say, the microwave region. You'd probably burn a hole through the planet.
Absolutely.
That's the power of coherence. And if you look at, let's say, the definition of matter, let's say, within quantum physics, what you have as the definition of matter is a polarity. You have a proton, so-called, with a positive, so-called charge, and surrounding it in some fashion, who knows how, so-called electrons, which are a negative charge. And well, what's the meaning of a positive charge? Well, it's only positive in relation to what is then called a negative charge. And a negative charge is only negative in relation to what is called a positive charge. So the two define each other. It's a self-defining unity. In other words, it's a self-unity. So polarity deals with the actual unified base of anything that exists in that sense. If you just even accept this definition of matter, let's say, from quantum physics. Go back to Tesla, say, what was Tesla doing, let's say, on the energetic side? So he's not dealing with kind of particles in this kind of particle mindset of quantum physics, et cetera. He's dealing with kind of waveform realities. And he's looking at creating those waveform realities through a particularly simplified means of configuring electromagnetic circuitry. And that means was that he created a kind of circuitry which was basically just a polarity. So if you create a circuit that's a polarity, that circuit can affect that which is a polarity by this waveform reality called resonance, where this rings and then that rings. You know, ring one of these little bells and other ones start ringing in resonance with that. So what Tesla did was he actually went to the absolutely simplest foundation of electromagnetic circuitry, which is polarity, i.e. he used a capacitor and an inductor and another capacitor and another inductor in two configurations which were opposite to each other, capacitor and inductor being opposite here, the two configurations as such being opposite to each other. He used opposition per se to vibrate into the core of what matter is. And that's a coherence science. And as a coherence science, it has a kind of power unavailable to incoherent science. So an incoherent science is actually it's technically a little bit difficult to explain, but it's where a person says, well, all exists is just one of these poles. So you go to Newton, he says, there's just particles, no waves. Or you go to, let's say, Einstein, he says, there's just waves, no particles. Any form of like mental configuration, which is configured like that, is, you could call it incoherent. And it will give you, at best, something like gunpowder. And if you compare the power difference between a matter-antimatter coherent directed laser beam to, what's the greatest power of a Newtonian destructive weapon?
It's not a nuclear bomb.
Right? Let's call it a catapult, just to kind of bring a little humor in. So you got a catapult and you got this earth-burning laser, which probably can go right through the planet. What's the power difference between those two? Expressed as a factor of 10. Is it 10 to the 6th, 10 to the 9th? Is it a million? Is it a billion? Is it a trillion times more powerful? It's somewhere in that region. And so Tesla, by configuring electronic circuitry in this very, very simplified way, vibrating into the kind of source reality of everything we experience, the power goes practically infinite, depending on what you're looking at and what you're comparing in that kind of analysis. So it's extremely powerful. And it implies that we no longer, by kind of generating this polarity and clarifying it, first maybe starting with stuff outside ourselves, but then maybe moving internally, we are no longer subject to things that affect material expression, like disease. And there's no question in my mind that Tesla technology can make a really huge headway in eliminating disease. For instance, you just vibrate the disease away.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
And so, when I looked at, I'm looking at all this in context, and I'm seeing, Tesla is really simple. It's like he's got electron, he's got magnetic, he's got the capacitor and the inductor, and he's making them all tuned to each other. So the entire unit, and it's not really fair to call it a circuitry because circuitry implies circle, and circle is only one part of a Tesla circuit, as it were. The whole unit is self-defining. It doesn't define itself from anything outside itself, which is the nature of Tesla electromagnetics. Tesla, by configuring it the way he did, he was able to drop into the wholeness vibration, as it were, of what material expression is. And if you take, let's say we conceive of an atom is whole, and it's kind of self-defined as that whole thing it is. If you take that wholeness away, the atom's gone. There's the destructive potential. But going into the wholeness vibration of what things are, you can also go in and cure inconsistencies and incoherences in that vibration, whose expression, I presume, is what disease is all about. Previously, I suggested that there is a valid reason for suppressing Tesla technology just because of its destructive potential. Mm-hmm. I don't think that's the only reason. My personal investigations have brought me to the place where I view the human constitution as we are constituted, as a basically a construction of opposites. And what that implies is that should we come into coherence in terms of the oppositionality inside ourselves, and I can kind of point out what I've discovered are oppositions, but when we come into coherence with those oppositions, just like let's say a Tesla technology, in the way it is operating, is all vibrating with itself in harmony and not kind of disharmoniously or destructively. When we come into that kind of coherence, then we then have creative potential. So you've heard all these stories about, these yogis on mountains who can, maybe create matter, can levitate, can do whatever, right? Turn into a light body. I don't think all those stories are true. I think some of them are. And I think those are realistic potentials for every person on this planet. And if you ask the question, okay, if that's true, that we have this potential, how do you get a race of animals like us to pay the right attention to the right kinds of places in order to develop that coherence? Because it just doesn't happen on its own. It takes actual personal decision making to do this and not do that, or to change something, or to become aware of something in some fashion. It appears to me that the best way to kind of bring people into their own process in the direction of that kind of self-coherence is to give them themselves and themselves only. And that means cutting off all the connections, which are distractions from me learning about myself merely as who I am in myself as my own energies. And if I'm concerned about building spacecraft and going out and flying, I'm not looking at what it means to be a feeling person in this kind of relationship, whatever, right? And I have full access to my own experience anytime of any day. And when people complain, and I understand the complaint because I've, complained myself and have been angry about, suppression and deceit and all that kind of stuff, I'm only complaining about a configuration of my own experience. So I'm complaining about myself. And so there's never a moment when I'm not experiencing myself. And it seems to me that a pretty strong argument can be made that confining people to this earth experience is a potent means of getting them to look in the right direction toward developing themselves interiorly to get to know what is in fact my own experience and what is the character of that experience. And for my own investigations, I look and, I've got thinking up here and I've got feeling down here, and I look at those and I go, well, those look opposite to me. It's like feeling is kind of like magnetic and waveform-like, and thinking is kind of like binary light digital, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. So we have light gravity, digital particle, wave. And I go, okay, so that looks to be opposite, but I'm just drawing that from my own experience. That's all I'm doing. And nobody is telling me that. And in drawing that from my own experience, it becomes pretty fundamental in my own self-understanding, because it's not received knowledge. Mm-hmm. Somebody telling me this is the way, et cetera, et cetera. It's not that. So the suppression of Tesla technology and all that it implies, i.e. spaceships zipping around the universe and teleportation and everything, time travel and material creation and destruction and all that kind of stuff, that's a little beside the point of getting to know myself. Right. And so I can see also a reason for suppressing those connections, scrubbing the planet of evidence of those connections, which the planet looks to be totally scrubbed. It's like pyramids of Giza. Where is the civilization surrounding those pyramids with that kind of scientific know-how, having built those structures? Right. You need an entire society around that. It's not just some farmer Joe who said, "Oh, pyramids, I'm going to align them to these stars and they're going to do magical stuff," right?
Coincidence, right?
Yeah. So it's been scrubbed.
Bullshit.
It's all sitting in the basement of the British Museum, but for
Or
good
the
reason.
Smithsonian.
And the Smithsonian,
Yeah.
and every museum around the
Yeah.
planet, which is
Yeah.
dedicated to having a big, big basement.
Yeah.
That's one of their primary purposes, I think. And I think there's good reason for that insofar as if from my investigations, if those have some bearing on who we are as a species, I think we are unique in being given access to the kind of oppositionality, root oppositionality that gives you access to creative destructive power. These little guys aren't going to get there because they're mostly balanced toward that region of their body. This thing up here is kind of guides them a little bit, but it's a little weak, right? Right. So they're not going to be creating, matter out of nothing, right?
Right.
Given enough time, maybe. But I think we as let's say a project in this universe, and it appears we are because it wasn't a bunch of hunter-gatherers who scrubbed the planet. It was a bunch of ETs, no doubt. And I can't prove that, but it's like, who had the design? It wasn't a bunch of hunter-gatherers. And that's our only answer from our little confined point of view. You take a broader point of view and just inject some kind of broad point of view assumptions here that somebody's concerned about us. And I can see that concern in suppression of Tesla tech so that we don't blow ourselves up. I can also see that concern in suppression of Tesla tech so that we pay attention to who we are in our kind of internal constitution and the way we work, to be able to kind of self-organize in the most ideal fashion, which I believe is coherent. I think we're their project in that sense. And it doesn't matter if we are or not. The fact is that we have this potential inside, which if we care to use it and go that direction, suddenly who cares about whether, it took 50 more years to get off oil. I'm glad oil was around because, geez, at least I was able to drive a little bit and get somewhere when I didn't have this teleportation capacity, right?
Right.
Right. Yeah.
Right, and there's this whole argument, and this is something we've talked about at length about, not an argument, but something that you consider that, when you see somebody, that person, I don't like that person because of that quality, you realize that, you probably have some of that quality in yourself.
Yeah.
And so in this way, everything's really a reflection of yourself, so.
Right. All you ever experience, even when you're bearing down and looking at let's say a Tesla circuit, all you're experiencing is your own awareness. It's just a configuration of your own experience that you're experiencing. And so that was what Tesla was able to do in paying attention the way he paid attention, was he was able to look holistically at something, compare his kind of initial response to it to the fact of what he was looking at, and go with the fact and say, okay, I need to conform to that fact, because this doesn't generate that fact. That fact is outside what I can conceive of. And so he was led by kind of his own kind of holistic understanding and being able to be distant from his own kind of, let's say, conceptual frame, to be able to be walked down a pathway through the simple facts of experimental occasions that he engendered in his life. And he walked down those and went into a different universe. I think that's awesome.
So did Tesla have a better ability to kind of tap into this morphogenetic field, do you think?
Oh, I think he did, yeah. I think he used it. I think, he had clear non-local abilities in the sense that in his self-proclamations, he claimed that his inventions came to him. That's his terminology. It came to me, whether in a dream or a kind of a vision that he would have in a given day. To my understanding, that kind of activity is a kind of non-local resonance. And so he was using the very resonance that he created in his devices.
Right.
So there was like a one-to-one relation in terms of his approach and what he created.